Welcome back to another episode of the Models Are Wrong podcast. Today we're going to be speaking to Martine Barons, which is really exciting. Just to kick off with a question. So in these days, mathematical models, I think it's safe to say, are being used more regularly in decision making. And there are those that might argue that it can be used as a way to displace responsibility from the decision maker onto the model, and a kind of way of avoiding almost making difficult decisions by just palming off the decision to, well, the model made the decision. And I think quite a good example of this might be in the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And there have been those that say that the idea that we are following the science was really a way of just not actually having to make the decision so much. So I'd love to ask the question to you. I mean, just to use that as an example of a way in which mathematical models are being used more, but perhaps being misused. Do you think that this is a common story? Do you think that mathematical models are perhaps being overused and misused?
I think, as you say, I think they're being scapegoated. So this was also true in the 2008 financial crash. You know, the models were being used by people for purposes for which they were not built, and by people who didn't understand them. But if you put a chainsaw in somebody's hand and they don't know how to use it, then they're going to come to a sticky end as well. So why single out mathematical models, which are one in a box of tools that we can use, to say that they are evil and blame them? It's, you know, the bad workman always blames his tools. I think mathematical models are being used not more than they were, possibly, but actually it's been more obvious that they're being used. So I think because of the pandemic, the epidemiology community, which has always been there and always been extremely active and important, I think they have just become more visible. So I think that I'm not sure that models are being used more. I think they're just more in the public consciousness than they were.
And do you think that things have moved on? What things are we behind on versus, like, so if they're in the public domain a little bit more, then the ways in which we make these decisions based on these mathematical models has to kind of evolve itself as well, right? Because there's communication with the public, there's communication with the politicians, there's communication with the scientists. Mm-hmm. Is that moving in the right direction? Do you think, are we kind of is that kind of not the problem, or is that one of the problems? Because sometimes I feel optimistic about it, and that these decision making, the ways in which we are making decisions, is moving forward. And then in other ways, there's examples like with COVID-19, often I found that it seemed like an outdated way of making a decision, but just with a sticky plaster of having a model to be able to say, yes, that told us that this was the right decision, and so we made this decision.
I think one of the things that has come out, particularly in COVID, is being able to see the scientists on the television screen and hear their responses to questions compared to the politicians. And for me, the depth of their expertise really came out. So any question that was thrown at them didn't faze them, because their depth of knowledge was such that they had already thought about the effect on this particular minority or that particular circumstance, and how that would work, and so on. So that was really kind of good. And I was really pleased that the public got a chance to see true expertise. One of the difficulties with politicians and other decision makers is that they rotate so fast. They have very little opportunity to learn both the strengths and the limitations of modelling for decisions. So one of the things we often say is it's decision support, not decision making. So it's a contribution. It is something to consider. If you say, well, if under these circumstances, we expect COVID cases to go up by between this and that, and under a different circumstance, the numbers are different, then that's one thing that you take into account in your decision making. But political acceptability the effect on different subgroups, that's something else that you take into account. It's another piece of data that you take into account, and that might be expertise from psychology, or that might be expertise from sociology. Mathematics is not the only person at the table giving a contribution here. So I think all of those things are really important. I don't think you can say we rely too much or too little on models. What we need to do is to understand what the model can tell us, but also understand what the model can't tell us, and what its limits are, to use them well.
I think that we, to pick up on the chainsaw metaphor, I think we need to be good, honest chainsaw salesmen and women. And the fact that we're on TV more, perhaps being chainsaw salesmen and women, is a good way of shining a light on it, I suppose. Yeah.
So let's take a step back, I guess. Martine, thank you again for joining us. You are, amongst many other things, I have to say, Director of the Applied Statistics and Risk Unit at the University of Warwick. Now, to someone who is not familiar with that sounds like a lot of words put together. Could you just outline your sort of role in that, and where the unit itself fits into this thing that we're talking about in terms of decision making using mathematical or statistical models?
Certainly. So the overall remit for the unit is to connect the cutting edge research that's being done in the Department of Statistics at Warwick with real world problems and problem owners, so that problem owners can have the benefit of cutting edge research in solving their problems, and that researchers can have the benefit of examining real world problems to inspire further research. So that's the basic outline. What does it look like in practice? It looks like a lot of networking, and it's a lot of practical problems to solve. So we've had recent work with the National Archives, for example, who had no way of measuring the risk to their digital archives. Digital archives are fairly new things. It's not that long since we were all analog. Probably it is to you young guys, but to those of us who are a little bit more mature, shall we say, it doesn't seem like 5 minutes since there was no internet. And now they have to do things like they have to store forever, because they are the National Archive, all the emails about discussing a certain safety issue, which might have embedded metadata, they might have attachments, they might have images. So they're quite complex objects. They also have to store things like the artificial intelligence algorithms, which decide who gets to stay in the country and who doesn't. So those are really important records. And yet, most digital carriers, storage devices, will last up to 5 years reliably. So you then have to copy them over. And then that is a risk that you're going to have some kind of copying errors. So they've been storing sort of physical objects, books and so on for decades, and they are really expert at that. But they hadn't got a way of actually saying, well, how do we do this? Where are the risks? How do the risks multiply together? Where do they actually cancel one another out? And what do we have to do to mitigate them? So we were involved in building them a model, which allowed them then to put a quantity on the sort of the range on the risk to certain elements, and then bid for more money to improve the storage, which will hopefully benefit us all in the long run, because those very important, socially and legally important items will be preserved for the future. In terms of the wider decision making under uncertainty, we're part of the analysis under uncertainty for decision makers network. So we're sort of leading in that, and we've got several catalogues. We've got a decision making under uncertainty tools catalog, so all the tools that exist for decision making, and then are categorized into what kind of decisions they help for. We've got a visualizing uncertainty catalog, which again is a multidisciplinary work, including psychologists and designers and digital humanities, how you can represent uncertainty visually, and how you can test it for different stakeholder groups. And then just recently we developed the communicating climate risk toolkit, which we were privileged to be able to launch at COP26 in the Blue Zone in the Science Pavilion. So all these things are trying to tackle decision making when there's uncertainty, and also communicating the uncertainty in that decision making.
I'm wondering which threads to tug on from this point. I'm mean, that's fascinating work. I'm tempted just to ask more about the archiving work, just because it just sounds so interesting. It's kind of not what I intended to speak about so much, but I want to hear more. So what kind of things went into the model? What was the modeling process like for that?
So we employed both soft and hard elicitation, and we built a Bayesian network model. So soft elicitation, just to clarify for anyone listening who doesn't know what that is, it's often called joint model building. So it's where the people, the problem owners, get to describe what the problem is and how they understand the causality in the system. So, for example, in the National Archive work, the thing that they were really interested in was to see if a particular document was renderable and if they had intellectual control of it. So, for example, I've got my, an old dissertation that was typed up in WordStar, which is no longer in existence and no longer supported. Can the archive then produce, perhaps using an emulator, a sufficiently good copy of that for that to be useful? And even the question of what is the original is quite interesting when you're talking about digital archives. Is it the bit stream? Is it how it looked on screen when it was made? So those are quite interesting questions to delve into. We had long conversations about that. And the intellectual control comes from, can we be sure this is the original as it was deposited in the National Archive? And can we be sure that it's the original 20 years later? It hasn't been falsified in some way or subjected to copying errors. So that's to do with sort of metadata and the preservation of metadata on both on the file and on the content. Then there are things going into the mix about the carriers and how many times you copy them and how you check that the copy is sound, because you can't open up every document and read it. You have to use checksums and those kinds of things. And then what affects that? And then there's still the physical risk. If there are floods or fires, that will destroy your digital archive in the same way. If your backup is off-site, what's the physical and environmental risks there? If your backup is cloud, what about if the cloud provider goes out of business? What's your backup then? So there's all sorts of things. And so basically we had a series of workshops with people from the National Archive and other archives explaining to us, and we were the ones asking the stupid questions, explaining to us how it all worked, from coming into the archive to being given to a user 20 years later. And we had to try and work out what level of granularity to model at, because everybody wants to put absolutely everything that can be in, but in the end, a model is a reduction of reality so that you can actually have something that's tractable. That's a judgment call. Again, the human side is coming in there. So it's the problem owner's perception of how the system works, the problem owner's perception of the causality. So we're obviously very much in a Bayesian framework here. We've got prior beliefs on these things. And so the Bayesian network, as you probably know, is a directed acyclic graph and a set of conditional independent statements. That's the definition of it. And of course, sitting underneath there is lots of lovely graph theory, measure theory, probability theory, all the other things that our pure colleagues love to play with, and without which we would have nothing to play with ourselves. So it does depend on all those, but we were able to construct a Bayesian network, the qualitative structure of which the archivists were happy to have consensus on. The next thing was to say, well, actually, how are we defining each of these nodes? Because they have to have a definition that's crisp enough, and you know what mathematicians are like, crisp enough to know if you get a particular instance, you can say whether it belongs in the set or outside the set. And in particular, has renderability been achieved or hasn't it? You have to have a definition of those things. And then they have to be measurable. So you have to be able to say if an event has happened or not. And so then you have to worry about whether you've got data then to quantify it. So then we looked at where the data was. That was quite a big piece of work, obviously on the TNA end, for them to dig out various surveys. And then there was maybe the surveys or the information was at the wrong granularity. We might, for example, we had a lot of information about a specific brand, of magnetic tape, because they use a lot of magnetic tape because it's the most reliable. So a particular brand of magnetic tape and how long it was good for. But that was too detailed. What we needed to have, we needed to cut it into rough categories of types of carrier and their expected lifespans, and a range on that. And then, of course, we got to a point where there were some nodes which we couldn't quantify at all because there was no data without which we couldn't build a model. Now, what we do quite a lot of in decision support is structured expert judgment. So this is hard elicitation as opposed to the soft elicitation of the model. And this is where we actually elicit quantities from experts. We do it in a structured way, because if you just phone a friend, then you're going to get one person's answer. If you just collect people like you, you're going to get probably just one answer, right? So structured expert judgment is a very interesting technique, which has parallels to experimental design, where you curate the data and you get a group of experts to give individual estimates, and then you pull them together in a specific way. Different protocols have different ways of doing that. But we do a mathematical aggregation after 2 rounds of discussion, and that's called the IDEA protocol. So then we were able to do that, to quantify the uncertainty of that, because the experts give us not only a best estimate, but a lowest plausible and the highest plausible. And we can use those as a distribution, a probability distribution over the values. And so then we were able to finish quantifying our network and do some testing as to see whether or not the archivists felt that the outcomes were plausible for different scenarios. So just to do some robustness training. And then actually lockdown had a very positive effect, because we had to run the elicitation online, which actually worked very well, which was nice. But we had all this money left over. So what we were able then to do was to hire some software engineers to turn our research level code into professional level code. And that meant that the National Archive were able to then host it on their webpage for anybody to use. And it's still there. And it won a Digital Preservation Award for its innovation. And we were also able, because of lockdown, to trial it with a wide variety of stakeholders, people who would use it, people who are archivists themselves from all sorts of different countries. So the only requirement was that you could speak English. So we had Brazilians and we had Australians and Americans all testing this out and telling us what was difficult to understand, where the questions that they have to fill in to sort of tailor it to their particular archive were unclear. So we did all this user testing, and then the software engineers were able to change the layout or the wording or whatever needed changing to make it so that it could be used. So that was a kind of end-to-end kind of production. It took 2 or 3 years in the end, but I mean, officially the project was a year, funding, but there was some pre-work. Then we actually decided we were going to do the project. We did the project, and then there was also the kind of usability testing and things like that afterwards. And they're still maintaining it, and they were able to argue for a substantial budget increase over an expectation of a flat budget. So they weren't expecting any increase at all, and they were able to get quite a substantial one because they're able to quantify the risks. So that was a very satisfying piece of work.
Yeah, that's such a really clear case study of the pipe. Like we kind of, as mathematicians, we kind of sometimes focus on our part of the pipeline, and then we kind of absolve ourselves of any responsibility of anything afterwards, and at the same time but at the same time benefit from what comes afterwards, because we get the funding because it leads to something else. One thing that I was thinking throughout that is that there's lots of different parties in this pipeline, and the communication between those parties, specifically the elicitation with experts as well as the software engineers, those are 2 very different, those 2 people speak very different languages, as well as the modeler speaking very different languages to those 2. Could you outline what the kind of teething problems are with that, or how might one go about overcoming the issues that come with having to communicate with so many different types of people?
Well, first of all, I think you have to recognize that as mathematicians, we are trained in a signature pedagogy. So our way of knowing things is trained into us. We are proof, theorem, lemma people. And we look down our noses typically at anybody else because their levels of evidence are not as rich and as certain as ours. That's very unhelpful because arrogance doesn't get you anywhere. So we have to realize that other people have other ways of knowing things and they're trained in their own pedagogies. So it's actually having the humility to learn another language. And I wrote a paper on this to do with interdisciplinary education. You know, if you're doing a cross-disciplinary kind of a degree, for example, you have to learn multiple languages, and it's one of the cognitive burdens, I guess, of that, and learning to do, to switch between them. So we do work, as I said, in the visualizing uncertainty and in the climate risk. We do work with psychologists, and we do work with digital humanities, as well as sort of strategic foresight and other people like that. And it takes a while. And I think one of the problems with the academic cycle is that time in the workload model is not built in, or in the grant cycle is not built in for this kind of stuff. And it's kind of hard work. But you have to go in with, I think, an attitude of humility, that you are learning somebody else's expertise. You recognize them as experts in their domain, and you don't sort of talk down to them. And one of the things that's useful, being kind of like the dumb mathematician, you can play up to that a little bit, and you can get them to explain it to you. So I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand that. Could you explain it again? And could you explain it again? And then it's quite interesting because you get in these workshop situations, and different people will, once you get to that kind of level of trying to explain it to the outsider, different people in the room will come up with different analogies, and they'd actually slightly disagree amongst themselves as to how they really see it. And so that's actually quite valuable to get some clarity on that. So it is very much about time and effort and energy and frustration, and sucking it up and going again, in that sense, and understanding how people understand things. Because again, it was very illuminating when we were testing the Bayes-Net model, the diagram it's called, the decision support model, because different people said, well, that was really confusing. I thought it was clear as day, but then that's how the users are the important ones in that scenario. If it's not clear to them, it doesn't matter how clear it is to me. So I think there's a lot to do, and I think we have to work in multidisciplinary ways. So for example, thinking about the sort of climate risk side of things, there was an example recently of they were trying to do some rewilding in Scotland, and they hired a psychologist to go with them, because it isn't all about the trees, it's about the people. And what they found was, people might be completely ambivalent about planting extra trees, but they found somebody, and that person was really, really interested in the levelling up agenda, in making families who live in the countryside prosperous. And they found a way of working together so that the trees would actually help that agenda. So everybody has their own ambitions and priorities. And by actually spending the time and working out how you can both get something out of this is really, really important in getting anything out of it, because otherwise you just end up setting up a dichotomy where you're just fighting each other.
I'm really interested because to me, this working with the whole pipeline while using your mathematical abilities and knowledge and all those things, it's very attractive to me. But I think that it's fairly clear that for quite a lot of people even in applied mathematics, unfortunately, it's not actually that attractive to. I kind of think that if it was that attractive, then we probably wouldn't be having a conversation that we're having in the way that we're having it, right? So I guess I'm interested to hear your perspective on how things are with that regard, and how you think that they should be in the future, with encouraging mathemaicians to be more considerate of the whole pipeline, whether it is just a fact of the kind of person that goes into maths, they're not particularly sometimes not that interested in that part, or where's the wiggle room? Where's the wiggle room that we can use to improve this situation, let's say?
Well, I think it's about incentives, isn't it? So if you think about your typical academic mathematician, they're going to get no kudos from the university in terms of their promotion, in terms of their grants, for doing anything other than producing more proofs and theorems. That's the only thing they're going to get positive feedback for. Yes, once every 7 years, the university wants an impact case from 1 or 2 people. But those people may have done it because they're really interested, and they might find in terms of their career, it's a hindrance rather than a help, because that particular university doesn't have a way of recognizing that in the promotion criteria. So I think a lot of people who do applied work and work with stakeholders do it because they are passionate about it, and almost in spite of their career ambitions and not because of them. So can we redesign the incentive structure to allow those people who are in the middle, who would do it but are not willing to sort of fall behind in terms of being in their career, to facilitate them to do it? Sometimes it's fear as well, because that language barrier is real. In some senses, it was easy for me coming late into mathematics. I was an ordinary person for a long time, a non-mathematician. And so as I was learning through my degree, I would always make analogies with things I already knew about. And that means it's much easier for me when I'm doing stakeholder engagement, whether that's problem owners or public engagement or whatever, to have an analogy for something, because that's how I learned my maths. That's how I fitted it into what I already understood. But if you've come straight through school into a degree, into a master's, into a PhD, and into an academic career, then learning the mathematical language has been part of your growing up, and you don't necessarily have so much practice in speaking and thinking in other ways. And I think that is a real difficulty. And again, it's kind of, how do you then allow space in the incentive structure for that learning to go on? In my unit, one of the things I'm trying to do is that I always propose a series of master's projects which are with problem owners. And so I curate those, I help write them, I do the negotiations for them, get the data and so on. And then I have to find colleagues who are willing to supervise them, because I can't supervise all of them myself. And some of them are more willing than others. And some of them I need to do some mentoring. Perhaps sometimes I would co-supervise so that they didn't feel they were in it on their own. Sometimes they would be happy to supervise, but they'd want some help on how Warwick does non-disclosure agreements, for example, and what do you do about this and what do you do about that? If the data was promised isn't forthcoming, and how do we get hold of that, and so on and so forth. So actually standing a bridge, as a bridge between the two cultures, is one of the things that I have to do. And I think, it can be hard for people who are willing, but they just need somebody who's going to help them to connect with that. And other people, it's not for everybody. Some people really, really don't like other people, not even other mathematicians. So they're much better off on their own doing the stuff that we need to be able to use later, right? So
yeah, absolutely. There certainly is just the people that get in there. So I just wanted to tug further on that thread. So you're saying incentives, the incentives need to be aligned, and that's perfectly reasonable. But what do you? Why do you think the incentives are what they are? Do you think that's just legacy? Do you think it's just that it used to be that it was less important, or less of interest for mathematicians to get involved with practical problems? Or why do you think that is the case, that the incentives are misaligned for this kind of work?
Well, I think if we think about where does mathematics come from, back in the day, it was the preserve of privileged men. They had to have enough money, an independent income or a sponsor to allow them to do the work. A lot of it was to do with classical mechanics, movement of the planets to start with, or engineering, bridges and so on and so forth. So that's where it started. So there wasn't always the disconnect from the world around us in that sense. But I do think that we have grown up to have the thing that's hardest to do, which is the most abstract stuff, be the pinnacle, and the applied stuff to be a little bit kind of, well, that's a bit easier for the people who are lesser. And can women even do mathematics, honestly? And this kind of thing. So I think there's a lot of legacy in there that is slowly changing for the better, but I think none of us can escape our upbringing. And I think that is the upbringing of the mathematics community, as I see it anyway, that there is even now, the expectation that women will do applied work because that's what they like. Women will contribute to impact cases because they just do mathematical, they do medical statistics, and that's all they can do. And somehow the pure stuff is superior and beyond measure in that sense. And then you have problems with universities thinking they can just close the pure side of the research in their universities, and that's a loss for everyone. And not, because they have made this false dichotomy of pure and applied, then they become vulnerable, because applied can show its value in the short term, whereas pure can't. The rest of the mathematics community who can speak up for the pure end, saying, no, we need these guys. We need these guys to be discovering the new stuff because we want to use it. Because they made this false dichotomy, then it splits the community. So there's lots of reasons, but they're reasons of culture. They're not reasons of essence, in the sense that there's no actual reason why we can't do things better or differently if we want to.
To speak from our experience, or my experience at least, we have a training course. So we're students at a Centre for Doctoral Training, which is essentially trying to get from just a straight PhD to something slightly more holistic in some way, in the context of what we've just been speaking about, basically. And one of the courses that we have to do is really aimed at getting mathematicians to think about things differently. It's a kind of ethics course. And some people really like it, and some people just really don't like it. And it gets me thinking whether you think that something like a course is the right way to go about it. I really don't know whether it is or not. There's no leading question here. But it seems like for different people might respond differently. And so I'm wondering about ideas about other things that we might be able to do outside of just courses, which some people will engage with and enjoy. Something, I don't know, day to day. Do you have any experience of anything like that that's going on, or do you have any ideas yourself as to how we might make it more integrated?
Well, the study groups with industry are an obvious choice, aren't they? So this is where, for people who are not aware, so the organisers will approach usually quite large businesses for a problem, and the mathematicians will come and have their accommodation paid for to come for a week and to crack on with these problems. So on the Monday, the problems will be presented, and you'll decide which one you want to work on. You'll form into groups with other people that you probably never met before, but they all have got some mathematical background, and you'll have an expert from industry who's presenting the problem, and you'll get together and you'll start formulating a problem with, every so often you give an update as to how far you've got, what approach you're taking. You might take several approaches between subsets of you and things like this. And then on the Friday, you'll present back as to how far you've got. And some of the time you just rule out approaches as infeasible. And some of the time you say this has got promise, and then that can be taken forward later if that's convenient to all concerned. But it's always an experience of working on a practical problem. It's quite time bound. So giving up a week or sending your students for a week, once a year, is not going to stop their progress on their regular PhD. When people who regularly do what we call pure mathematics have been persuaded to go, they have often really enjoyed it. And you do get this opportunity to see what it's like to speak to a problem owner, to speak across disciplines, to speak to somebody whose expertise is different from yours. And it just gives you that sort of time-bound, low stakes, but also real world experience. So I'm a big fan of those. So there's also the during study groups, which are more data driven. They're just as good. They're basically the same idea. In the Doctoral Training Centre where I did my PhD, we had 2 mini projects. They both had to be from different domains, and one of them at least had to have data. That was the rule. These were quite nice projects because they were only 3 months, and obviously they've been curated so that the supervisor, although the project, it wasn't a drill, it was real research, the supervisor had a realistic expectation that they would do in 3 months. How, an idea of how they would approach it was for credit. It was part of the course. At the same time, it was relatively low stakes because you had somebody who was helping you with that. And often in our doctoral training centre, they did have industry partners as well. And so it was a data set that had been, tidied up ready for you to use, but it was actually on, I don't know, something like, gas engineers visiting broken boilers, and how you would actually approach that to make that optimal, for example, or how you persuade people to change their minds on smart meters, for example. And that might be an agent-based modeling kind of an exercise, but you have real data to try and tune your model to produce realistic results and so on. And I think those are useful because you do see what can be done and also the limitations of it, because again, you're working with a problem owner, and they say, but what we really need to know is, not people who are reduced to a unit sphere, because that makes the analysis easy, but people who are real people.
Yeah, that's what me and Joe have struggled with this thing about, like, some mathematicians. It seems like at the moment they're kind of, the powers that be, quote unquote, realize that it's a problem, but everyone on this ladder of the hierarchy is just kind of trying to convince the person above them that they are training the people below them correctly. So, like, as in, they promise this course and yet they don't really have any care, really, it feels like, whether the course actually works. It's a really interesting one as to how you kind of do something that caters to all different types of people.
I think you can't do something that caters to everybody. I think what you have to do is to offer a range of options, because I can imagine, some people would like a course, but if you could do 3 study groups during the period of your PhD and get out of doing the course, that might appeal to other people, right?
Yeah,
or some people might want a year placement in industry, and it might be quite a technical industry, but they might enjoy it that way. So I think it is about, the trouble is it's been designed by people who are interested really in maths rather than maths education. And those are 2 different disciplines, really. And again, I think it will be, I like study groups with industry, so I'm going to suggest that. But other people might like something else, or it might be a case of what's feasible to deliver and to measure. So again, it's really difficult. It's about offering options, isn't it? And I think it's really important, because you can build in more bias if you do it one particular way. In a community where there are far more men than there are women, and where people of color report that they constantly feel like they're overlooked and looked down on, and they have to prove themselves at every single talk. If you then design something which is just one size fits all, it's probably going to fit a particular demographic and be another reason for other people to feel disadvantaged or disenfranchised. So again, I think recognizing that people are even mathematicians are not one type, and offering sort of equivalent and measurable, because this is education, but equivalent options for people to choose from, and give them the responsibility of choosing an option which they would like to do, even if that means that they have to swap later. So in the first year I decide I'm going to do the study groups, because that sounds like a very low cost thing to do, and then I really hated it, so next year I would then sign on the course because I've got to fulfill that part of my requirement, for example. Or somebody might want to do both, and provided that's not going to hinder their PhD, I don't see why they shouldn't be able to.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds like very sound advice. I wanted to just change topic a little bit. Yeah, I wanted to tie in our previous episode that we've recorded of our podcast. So we had Maria Axante, who her focus is more on machine learning and artificial intelligence, and the risks and benefits of integrating it into business processes, I think, mostly at the moment, at PwC, where she works. And it's a very interesting job, certainly challenging. And I'm very interested in what similarities there are between that work and the work of integrating mathematical models into decision making and other processes. because there's a lot of media attention on machine learning at the moment and its risks and what it's great for and the things that it's how it's destroying all of our lives on social media, etc.
Yes.
But I sometimes I'm quite skeptical, I suppose, about, well, how different is this really from what we've already been doing with mathematical models if you're applying them wholesale, let's say, or to large numbers of people, pushing it out when the leverage is high, I suppose. And so, yeah, I'd be interested to see what you thought about that. How similar are they, do you think?
Well, I think it's jolly easy to build a bad model. Right? So you can build a bad model because the data isn't there, or you're building it on theories which are less well substantiated. You're ignoring the uncertainty and making a deterministic model for a stochastic situation. So when Virginia Eubanks wrote Automating Inequality, she knew what she was talking about, because if you have bad data to build your AI on, it's going to learn the prejudices that you have. And some of the things that she outlines in there is that what you want to measure ideally is often not available. So you measure a proxy instead. But then when the results come out, you don't actually remember that you're measuring a proxy instead. And you say, well, therefore, this person is at risk of abusing their child and should have their child taken away from them. And that is a very serious life choice, both for the parents and for the child. Irreversible damage will be done to everyone. And yet she explains that in the American system, you have a lot of contact with the public social services for two reasons. One is that you are in trouble, but the other one is that you are poor and you can't afford your own private healthcare or your own private sort of counseling or whatever you do. And so disproportionately, the poor are treated as if they were the feckless. And that's, and people believe the models because they don't understand what they're measuring. And to me, that doesn't really matter whether that's an AI model or whether that's a Bayesian network or whether that's a linear regression or what kind of model is underneath that. If it's biased and disadvantaging people, then it's not fit for purpose, is it? No model can do everything that you would like. You have to understand what it is. So I think there's responsibility on both sides. Responsibility on the side of the model creator, but also on the model user to know what it is fit for purpose for and what it isn't. So I'm just teaching professional practice in data science for my final year undergraduates at the moment. And for that, what I did was a series of interviews with people who are actually working in data science. And one of the things I asked them was about what is the place of ethics in data science. And all of them thought it was extremely important. One of them brought out that they thought that the communication of the model and its strengths and weaknesses, what it can and can't do, is an ethical issue for the modeler. It's part of their professional ethics to communicate that properly. And I think if I think of one of my sons is a graphic designer, and when he sends out a new design, he sends it out with a document which tells you what the font is called, what the colors are, what the CYMK is, so that if you have it printed or if you have it reproduced in a different way on a website, you've got all the information that you need to do it faithfully. And I think what we need is probably a minimum set of information that goes out with every single mathematical type model that is mandatory, and with clear definitions, so that once you've learnt, if you're a user of mathematical models and you've learned what these things mean, they mean the same in the next model and the next model and the next model. So I think that would be, a bit in the same way as we do when we're publishing medical studies. If you're doing a randomized control trial, you have to fill in a form that says how many patients you started with, how many dropped out, why they dropped out, what was the inclusion criteria. So that research can be reproduced. So I'm thinking, something along similar lines for mathematical models, I think would be difficult to do, but I think it's something we should be thinking of and aiming at least trying to do that.
That sounds like a good idea, because as soon as when you're trying to explain things to non-domain experts, it is so helpful to have a set of a set of things that if you at least understand these aspects of it, then at least you'll get some of the important information about this model for its use. And it's definitely a skill knowing what to leave out when you're trying to explain a model to somebody else. And yeah, and if you have these fairly standard handles that they can use to understand it, that would be really great.
So one thing I did kind of want to ask, I was thinking during what you last said about how some of the risks attached to automation are basically uniform across mathematical models, Bayesian statistics, statistical models, even linear regression or any sort of mathematical model, and machine learning and AI.
Yeah.
And I agree with that. And we sort of talked with Maria about that last time, that, any sort of new technology, even forgetting about automation, perhaps just any sort of new technology seems to sort of entrench the power that's in the society. That's just kind of how it's, because that's who owns the technology. They use it for their own purposes, etc. I was wondering if there is any sort of nuances between, or anything that you think is different about mathematical models versus machine learning versus AI, because if they're certainly very similar, and there's certainly things that each field can kind of learn from the other in this ethics sort of domain. Is there anything that we should be careful about in terms of picking from, ethics of AI and then just kind of sticking it onto mathematical modeling? Or do you truly think that pretty much everything is quite uniform?
Well, they are different, of course. I think in terms of ethics is about asking a series of questions and getting sensible answers to those questions. And I think in that sense, it's kind of universal. But for example, properly done, statistics is not as susceptible to bump hunting as AI, for example. So if you're going in with no pre-specified model, no model of the data generating process, and you're just saying, I'm going to put a deep neural net on this and see what we can find, then it's of limited usefulness, because you don't know why. And humans always want to know why. And what in my PhD, I did some machine learning on medical data to see if we could find out for whom a particular treatment was suitable. But I did that and compared it with a regular statistical model, which was white box. And one of the things that was very interesting was that actually the medical profession are required to take responsibility for a decision that they make. So they are very resistant then to any kind of automation, because if they don't understand how the algorithm or whatever came to the decision, then they don't feel they can take responsibility for it. So that was a very interesting way of thinking about it. So some people, I think in Manchester, have done some really interesting work in kind of unpicking the AI afterwards, and then framing it in terms of decision trees or similar kinds of schematics in order to help the medics have confidence in it. But the best kind of AI for medicine is the kind of thing that looks at sort of machine vision, that looks at scans and things like that. And so the scan picks up a result, but then it's there for the human to check their answer in that sense, because machines don't get tired and miss things. So it's like a second opinion. So that's where the real strength is. So that the frail human in that sense is not so frail as to miss things. Far fewer people get missed on for example, a mammogram if they have a machine vision, a machine learning algorithm helping. But because of the responsibility aspect, you can't fully automate that, at least not at the moment. So there's those kinds of things. So there are things you can do, and again, the mathematical modeling problem is going to be that you put a deterministic model based on sort of physics theories onto a stochastic system, and that's not going to work. And the example of that I have is in the nuclear emergency decision support. So some colleagues of mine were involved in RODOS after the Chernobyl accident. There was money to help make decision support for that kind of a scenario. And of course, you've got to make decisions very, very quickly, but you've got to you've got to pull together lots of different domain experts. So you've got the physics, the engineers of the plant, how much is going to be released, how long until we can plug the leak. But then you've got the meteorologists that are going to tell you where it's going to drift, how high it's going to be, when it's going to come down, is it going to rain, is that going to land the radioactive material? Then you've got the doctors, the medical doctors, who are going to say, well, actually, with this dose or this exposure, the lifetime cancers are going to be this, or the risk for the next 5 years it's going to be that, birth defects are going to be this, and so on. And then you have the political side of it. What's acceptable. We do know that if you evacuate people, and particularly if you evacuate old people, they tend to die. So that's something to be taken into consideration when you're choosing between issuing iodine tablets, telling people to shut their windows and doors, and taking them to somewhere else. But as this went on, more and more the sort of physicists sort of approach, it became more and more deterministic, this model. So although it's very useful, they felt it could be more useful. And that's where the integrating decision support system was born, which is a more probabilistic take on that. So we've developed that with the nuclear example in mind, but it's now been used in lots of different modeling scenarios, from food security to pollination to national security. So lots and lots of examples of the integrating decision support system paradigm. And the basic idea is this, that you have all these different panels of experts, and you can set up conditions where their parameter space is a product space, and so you can actually have genuine separation between them, and each one can update their information autonomously. But you tell them the series of decisions you are considering, and they'll tell you, given that decision, we expect the distribution over outcomes to be this, and then that can be passported through a network to give a multi-attribute utility score, and then you can compare different possible decisions that you might make and rank them. But of course, again, that is not decision making, it is decision support, because actually the one that's second best or third best might be more politically acceptable or feasible in the time or whatever, and you might pick that one, but you do at least have some reason, some measure of how much worse it is than the best one that you could possibly have. And the reason it's really important to have the incorporation of uncertainty in that is because what you don't want is to tell people that the optimal solution is something which is very, very good on average, but has a huge variance, because you want something that's actually taking the variance as well as the sort of main score into account. So you need to really account for that. So rather than saying this is the reasonable worst case or whatever, you can actually say this is what's likely to happen between this and this, and that being a reasonably narrow band.
Yeah, so we were speaking to Mike Tildesley, who you may or may not know at Warwick, and he had a very depressing anecdote about politicians like having to simplify the information that you give to politicians to such a level where, for example, the variance is completely forgotten by the time you get to the person who is really actually making the decision. So then I was thinking about, we've talked a little bit about communication between the different people that are working on something, technical versus non-technical, as well as with the stakeholders. I was wondering then about communication with politicians, or the so-called decision makers who sort of have no training potentially in the thing or the tools that are supporting these decisions. How do we go about, how does it at the moment work? Do you have any experience of communication with politicians, or indeed decision makers in industry that don't have don't have any training in the tools that are supporting these decisions?
Yes. In our experience, the best people to target are the civil servants or the council officers, because the political leaders will come and go, and their cycle is very short. And even if their cycle isn't, even if they're long-standing politicians, their roles will change, and they have a very limited ability or a time to develop a level of expertise, which as going back to the beginning, I was saying it was quite interesting seeing the politicians stand next to the experts. somebody who spent 40 years developing an expertise in something can speak in a richer way than somebody whose portfolio it's been for the last 10 minutes. And that's just the system that we're in. But the people who are longer lasting are the council officers and the civil servants, and they very often do develop a reasonable expertise. I think there is a campaign to improve the mathematical literacy of public servants. That would be a good thing, I think, particularly if they are using any kind of data-driven or mathematical modeling or whatever, because if you present it in a certain way, you can mislead people with data as well as inform them, right? So yes, was it yesterday or the day before, somebody saying that because Doctor Who is a woman, young men are going to prison and turning to crime? That was an MP. Really? Anyway, yeah. So that's not a good use of data. So I think there's a lot of things to consider here. So if I'm going to communicate with you and you're going to rely on my expertise, we both have to do some work, and I appreciate that it is our responsibility as mathematicians, mathematical scientists, to try and make our work accessible and to try and speak truthfully and yet simply, which is very hard to do. But then the person who wants to use our work really ought to meet us halfway. I mean, it's fine to take everything out of the box and try and put it together without looking at the instructions, but you might break it. That is the risk you decide to take, and the same is true with mathematical modeling and statistical modeling and so on. You have to know what it's for. You have to know what it can do and what it can't do. Your brand new super duper TV is not a hammer. It's a TV and it does a TV's job. If you use it as a hammer, you're going to break it, and you're not going to have a TV anymore, as well as not achieving what it was you needed the hammer for. So I think the human side of it is so important. And yes, it's fine for mathematicians to have to constrict themselves only to the mathematical sphere, provided there are somebody who can do that translation work, somebody who can stand with a foot in both camps and talk in ordinary language, which is why people like Ian Stewart, who do so much public engagement, are very valuable, because they have got this winsome way of talking, very simply about various things. And Ian says to me that, it's not possible to communicate things in a way which is accessible without losing some of the detail. And I think that's what, as mathematicians, that goes against the grain. It's not what we're taught to do. It's not how we're trained, and it is difficult, therefore, for us to think that we are not compromising in some way. But it is all about what do they need to know. As educators, lecturers, we have to say, what do these students need to know to pass? What would you ideally like them to know? And those two things are often very different.
Certainly. I think one question I would like to touch on is, we've already touched on it, but placing responsibility for decisions. And when you have models that perhaps were made collaboratively, and then people use those models, how you place responsibility, basically? Because it's such a difficult question. Who is responsible for the misuse of a model, or when you say misuse of a model, that's already suggestive for a bad decision. And when a model was part of such a decision, how you do that. I mean, particularly when the person using the model does not have a full understanding of it. I don't know whether you have any kind of particular insights there. I mean, I haven't really posed a specific question, but it's just something that's very interesting, and something that I've thought about in terms of artificial intelligence as well, and the different ways that you could try and create a situation where somebody or some set of people are held responsible, despite the fact that ultimately there is no way of explaining the decision made by the artificial intelligence model. Whether essentially the explainability problem can be ignored to some degree by making a hard and fast rule that, well, it's on you. If it doesn't do the thing that you want, it's on you. So make sure that it's at least as reliable as you're willing to take the risk of it being. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I think Hannah Fry has got a lot to say on this subject, and she's probably more eloquent than I am to explain it in detail. But I do think, I think there is something about the minimum standards, because we can't do anything about, I mean, even as two mathematicians, you and I might misunderstand each other. We can't do anything about that in a sense, except to make every effort to do what we can to understand. And we need to get away from this idea that, the problem owner chucks a ball over the fence and the mathematicians solve it and will solve a different problem usually and then chuck it back. It is all about the communication. And I think, if we had a minimum set of standards for an algorithm that it had to pass, some tests that you had to do, in terms of the quality of the data or particular cases and things like that. Because we always have, don't we, in machine learning, we have, or in algorithms in particular, we have standard data sets that we use to test how fast and how good an algorithm is. Maybe we could find some ways of testing algorithms before they're licensed to be used for certain purposes. Maybe like drugs, we can license them for some things and not for everything. Maybe then if they're used off license, the human who used them off license is responsible. I mean, I don't have a full answer to this, but there are some parallels we could draw on. It may not be the manufacturer's, or the designer's fault that my car broke down in this particular way. But if it is a design flaw, because lots of them are breaking in this particular way, we know how to hold that person accountable, don't we? Even if it's a corporation and they just get fined or, expensive recall or whatever. So I think it's not beyond the wit of man, as it were, to devise something which is going to be suitable. But it takes a lot of discussion as to what exactly that should be, because algorithms are used for, and models are used for lots of different things. So I'm thinking about minimum reporting standards. I'm thinking about a common set of language for describing what they can and can't do. I'm thinking about testing before they get licensed. And I'm thinking about sort of, you wouldn't let just anybody drive, a digger. So maybe you have to have a minimum credentials to actually use this model. A bit like you do with chartered accountants. You can have people working for you who are not chartered accountants, but it's the chartered accountant that has to sign off the accounts. They have to take responsibility. But before they're allowed to do that, they have to become chartered. So there are parallels we could draw on in ways that we've already regulated important things where people might come to harm. Professional standards are really, really important. So the IMA and the RSS and the OR Society and others are pulling together a set of standards for data science because it's a new and emerging profession. So this is really important. What are the professional standards of users of mathematical models, and are they keeping up with that? Of course, people make choices, and some people might be quite happy to sign off on something which they know full well is actually being exploitative or whatever. But that's a different problem. In some sense, that's a problem of human beings and ethical behavior. So I think there are ways forward. It's just a case of the will to do it, and deciding what it should be. And it's not an easy question to answer, but I don't think it's unanswerable.
No, I think I have the same intuition, really. Exactly. It doesn't seem unanswerable, and it doesn't seem like sometimes people, again, I'm drawing on artificial intelligence, but the explainability problem makes it kind of unusable, or this thing that is so unfamiliar to all of us that it's impossible then to handle this problem. It feels to me absolutely like you were saying that through these mixtures of different ways which we handle responsibility and explainability of the decisions that we make in all of these different scenarios that are quite familiar to us, makes it seem perfectly reasonable that we can do that. One thing, though, that I think is an interesting point is that to realize the issue as the mathematicians, and then to make sure that you're doing the best you can to facilitate this ahead of time. Otherwise, you might end up not being allowed to do the things that you wanted to do.
And I think there's a lot of things, aren't there, as mathematicians, as we were doing the process of model building, we were making assumptions all the time. And actually, having to produce a record of every assumption. And a bit like when you do data cleaning and you have to actually show the code you used, so you know how you transformed any one of those variables, how you fixed the problems, so that if an error has come in that particular point, or if it makes a difference how you did it, then that's actually transparent. at least to somebody who's on a level with you, who would be the person. So you'd have technical people signing off the algorithms or the models in that sense, to pass them fit for use.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That I find it funny, or ironic rather, that often when there's a model that it's clear as a mathematician reading the paper that they've made certain assumptions, and that you wouldn't be able to do something with this model that someone else might think on a first read that you would be able to. But as soon as you ask the scientist, the modeler, they say, yes, of course I've made that assumption. Of course, like they know exactly what the consequences of those assumptions are. It's just as we've discussed, the incentives around communicating those assumptions and indeed, perhaps more importantly, the consequences of that. So, it's okay, I've used this prior, which is an assumption. Someone reading that they're using this prior as opposed to another prior might have no idea about what that actually means in terms of a foundational sort of real life assumption and what consequences that would be for using the model. And so, yeah, building the incentives or recreating the incentives around that so that it's made very important for the scientist, for the architect of the model, to be very clear about the assumptions that they're making, and then perhaps them even communicate with the next person along in the pipeline and say, I'm making these assumptions. Is that realistic? Is that reasonable? Something like that. And then there's some two-way sort of translation, as we've been discussing, where they can say, oh, that's completely unreasonable. You should, why have you made that assumption that it never holds? Just a funny one that I'm doing a module that's called Modeling in the Life Sciences. And I asked, have you got any examples where they make completely contradictory assumptions? And he actually said that there's some papers that he's read that they make an assumption to simplify the model that some length is above some scale, above some number. And in the same paper, they make the assumption that it's below some number, and that the intersection of those is zero. So it's completely. But in some ways, I feel like we've that's kind of lost on us now with machine learning. We don't really care if there's any real life sort of coherence. We just care that it gives us a good training or test set results or output, and then we can use it on anything, no matter whether there's some grounding. So I think, yeah, it's really interesting getting the discussion about what do these assumptions mean on a real life level, and what do they mean for the consequences of this model, and how do I communicate that?
But even if we take a leaf out of the medical publishing's book, where if you've done an observational trial, you have to do this, and if you've done a randomized control trial, you have to report that. There are different things depending on what type of study. You have to fill in this form, and it's a standard form that everybody has to fill in. You can imagine that if you were doing an AI model, you'd have one. If you were doing a Bayesian model, you'd have another. If you were doing a sort of more of a regression model, you'd have a different one. But these could all be reported in standard format. And the big advantage of that would be the next person down the line. So we've been recently thinking, obviously, about communicating climate risk, but the person synthesizing all the latest information coming out of the scientific community about climate and climate risk could then have a way of comparing and contrasting the different pieces of information, because they could compare the reported, assumptions and things like that much more transparently. Now, it's their job to synthesize that for the next person down the line who's going to sort of talk to the policy designers. But, so you can see that you could facilitate or sort of reduce the risk of miscommunication by having standard format for reporting. And of course, it wouldn't fit everybody in. It's a jolly nuisance to have to fill this thing in. But, in some senses, having the same information from everybody about this thing is a useful way for comparing and holding to account to some degree, finding out where you're actually comparing two papers that seem superficially similar, but they're based on such different assumptions. And again, you need a level of being on the inside of that community to really pick that out. But if it was done in a more transparent way by reporting, this sort of metadata on the paper, these assumptions have been made, these models are of this type, they're AI models, or they're Bayesian models, or they're regression models, for example, and therefore we're reporting these things. What's the uncertainty, and this is how we've handled it and how we've reported it. So it would help, in some ways to actually standardize the reporting, which would then help the people who are relying on synthesizing that for the policymakers to be able to do that more easily and more transparently. And so you could then sort of cut down some of the problems that we're having, because it's kind of a bit of a free-for-all.
Yeah, definitely. I sometimes definitely feels like journals are written for other people in the same field to read, and certainly not for anybody who's trying to actually use it. And like just the incentives, of course you don't report it in a way that's then easily digestible if all you care about is impressing your next employer or somebody who's doing similar work.
That's why we have the signature pedagogy, so you know how to communicate with the people you need to impress to get your promotion or your job or whatever, right? So you have to learn the in language, and you have to learn the in values, and you have to learn, what is considered, gold standard, and what is excellence. And that's really, really hard, because excellence very often has a particular gender or color or whatever, because it's a judgment call, and excellence when you see it, but it may be a way of thinking and a way of speaking, which is kind of people like me, as it were. So
I really like that idea about standardizing. It's easy to forget that these are not new problems, that the things that we're finding with AI and automation are not new problems. We can map, and it's important to also understand what we can't map across, but definitely there is a lot of overlap with other things, like what you were saying with doctors and people in the medical field, really understanding the risks attached to decisions that they're making, and therefore being slightly more hesitant to be using these things when they don't truly understand it. I think it's really important to realize and remember that we have tackled these same problems in other fields quite a bit, and not necessarily the exact same solution, but similar solution, or at least a really good starting point is to use that.
Yeah, and I think this is one of the strengths of interdisciplinary work. Of course, it takes time and energy, and can be difficult as well. But other ways of doing things, other cultures of doing things in terms of transparency and things. When it matters, you have to have procedures to make it transparent, because people's lives are at risk here. And my toy model about baking bread or something like that may not be life-threatening, but that there are good reasons to think, well, actually, if we are going to use these things more widely, maybe we can borrow strength from people who've faced these kinds of problems before, people coming to harm because of their research. And I think that there can be quite a lot of strength in that, and also in the same way, trying to make social science replicable, so the reproducibility crisis in there can be helped by these kind of procedures. And a friend of mine did a PhD in exactly that, looking at what kind of reporting would be standardized across social science and psychology experiments, for example, that would make them reproducible in the similar way to the checklists you have for the British Medical Journal. So in a sense, it's something we can all understand, having a checklist for things, is it? And designing it would be a job, I tell you. But if the journals imposed it, it would certainly be there. People would do it because they would get published, and that goes back to incentives.
To play devil's advocate, well, it's not really playing devil's advocate, because it's not really against anything that we've been saying, but one thing to bear in mind is the magnitude that comes with automation, the magnitude of the risks.
Yeah.
Even though they might be the same sort of risks, you might deal with them very differently if it's times a billion, right? Like, with a doctor making a decision might affect one patient. An automated doctor making a decision might affect the whole like everyone that went into a hospital ever. And so yeah, in that way, that there is some new work to be done, I guess, with to the furthest along the spectrum is nuclear weapons, right? That they just sort of decide, well, we've got new weapons before, but these things are just a completely different beast. And I don't think that AI is a completely different beast in the same way that a nuclear weapon is, but it's kind of on that track, right? That we do have to do some thinking about the punishments or barriers that we can't just fine someone for doing something that is going to like destroy society as we know it, for example. And so thinking about that is kind of, I think that's part of the new problem that gets brought in with AI, as well as the old problems of interdisciplinary work and thinking about regulation and so on.
Yeah, so I think it's true, isn't it, that the extent of the damage you can do, then, but the balance between facilitating something which is positive and also guarding against the negative is an age-old problem, isn't it? For and we faced it before in the sense of the Industrial Revolution. You used to have lots of individuals doing lots of individual stuff, and then automation came along, and suddenly we were all getting sheets woven by the same machine across the whole country. And this was a new thing, and although we're not going to die of bed sheets probably, but the idea is there, the fact that there comes some new technology which then completely changes and uniformizes in some senses the effect of individuals, and then puts a lot of power into individual hands, and with power comes responsibility, it should do anyway. And this is why the sort of going back to the automating inequality book, this is why it is so bad, because there are hundreds and thousands of people who are being misjudged because the data on which these algorithms are based are flawed, or the proxies they're using are unsuitable, or measuring something different from what they intended to measure, and so on. So the reason why these things do need a thorough testing and a certificate of before they can be used really is because you need to test for these things. You need to work out what subgroups are going to be significantly impacted and disadvantaged by this, and decide if you can live with that. Then we're coming back to the people again, aren't we? We come back to the human element.
There's also the sort of, when you scale something up, it's one set of biases or risks or whatever, which is then affecting everybody, rather than having pockets of slightly different risks and slightly different biases in different places. You hope that then you don't have you're not so vulnerable to individual large problems, not so many single points of failure, etc.
And this is exactly the problem, with climate risk, for example. So there's very little data in Africa about African climate, and there are no models that are coming actually out of Africa with their perspectives and their knowledge in it. And yet parts of Africa are extremely vulnerable to changes of weather and climate. So at the very point at which they are most vulnerable, there is the least data, and the models give them least information. So, again, that's a human problem. That's kind of about research funding, and it's about accessibility and equality and other things, isn't it? So it's a human problem giving rise to a big sort of data modeling problem, which is not giving us the information we need at the points where we really need it.
I find the phrase a little bit lazy, but it is like a mirror, isn't it? That it kind of just reflects back to us what these problems, when you drill them down, are just human, even though the thing that is doing it is not human. And so we just kind of see these biases. But then again, I'm not sure I really buy the fact that we ever didn't have these large scale biases. Like everyone had in one country, a lot of people will have the same bias, and that is similar to an AI. So there is definitely a lot of overlap and with problems that we've faced before. Whether we've solved those problems before is a completely different question. I think that lots of these things, we haven't begun to solve, and maybe AI can help us. I don't know. Maybe redefining the problem in this sort of way will help us get to grips with it. Not that it actually will help us like it will frame it in a different way that we can recognize more easily than recognizing it in our, like, it's not that we're bad people, it's that the algorithm's bad, and that might actually in a funny way help us to think about it a little bit differently. I don't know.
Well, if we can dissociate it from being personal, then we're likely to be a little bit less emotional, a little bit more rational about it.
Yeah,
I think there's a little bit of an analogy, isn't there? But, the British Empire, for example. So we do the things that work very well in England, and then we just completely wholesale export the ways of doing things, the English ways of doing things, to other territories where culturally and environmentally they're completely inappropriate. And I think that is a difficulty. So I think, we have prejudices, of course we do. And at some point, it's part of our culture to believe certain things or do things in certain ways. It becomes a problem when we start hurting people with it. One of the things I learned, which I thought was fascinating when as part of my work on household food security, is that concepts of land ownership are not the same the world over. So we buy land in this country, and it's all of the land is owned by somebody. And we go over and we go to another country and we try and buy land, but people feel that the land belongs to everyone, or even that the people belong to the land. And so actually having legal title over tracts of land is not the same. There's not the same conception over there. So actually then, you have different ways of doing things. So that was very interesting to me, that you would have those different ideas, that everything isn't done the way we do it. The concept, even owning land, isn't the same.
Could you outline that food security? I remember me and Joe actually saw it on your website, and we were interested when we were talking about it before. Could you outline that, what the problem was, and the project in sort of some general terms?
Yeah, well, it's an ongoing research interest that I have, applying evidence-based decision making in the food security space. So particularly focusing on high income countries like the UK, Australia, US. So we know that food banks are a relatively new deal for the UK, but they have become endemic in Canada and the US. So they really came to be in 2008 financial crash, and people were finding themselves out of work and from struggling to pay the mortgage and feed the children at the same time. So food banks grew up, but they are only an emergency assistance. They don't actually solve the problem, because the problem isn't that somebody doesn't have food. The problem is that they don't have money to pay for everything to live on. So we have people who are food insecure in leafy Warwickshire, where I'm from, and it's hard to imagine, but it's really true. And how do we have long-term successful interventions that are going to get people out of that situation? The food banks themselves don't believe they are a solution. They know that they are a stopgap, and what they would dearly love, Trussell has said this time and again, is to be put out of business by the lack of need. So then there's a lot of interventions which do things like situate citizens' advice within the food bank, because some people are not getting the benefits to which they're entitled, for example. And some people need help with debt counselling in how to consolidate their debts in a sensible way, how to negotiate with people they owe money to, and so on. And other people are tackling sort of the welfare state and what it's there for. Are we doing it right? That kind of thing. Are we, excluding certain types of people? So again, this is a integrated decision support system type of approach, because everything from economic approaches which do increase or decrease employment and wages, to the price of oil, which affects food prices so drastically. So we're trying to do things in a local way. I'm involved in feeding Coventry and feeding a Warwickshire Food Forum, with all the other people who are trying to, from the councils, are trying to do things on the ground, doing some evaluations of various interventions, as you would for medical interventions, to seeing what actually works in the longer term, trying to get them away from this, just asking a few people for their opinions, trying to get them into a quantitative mindset. We've done a decision support, a proof of concept, which has just been published in Series A, how you would go about that, showing how you do the integrated decision support system thing. But again, we're running into difficulties in terms of, the fact that the people turnover is huge, and the people who were interested in it, we go away and do the research, we come back 2 years later and they've moved to a different job, or they've been made redundant or whatever. So there is a certain amount of traction there. But at the moment, I'm doing some interviews with people who are working there, working in food banks and advice centres, and some people who are experiencing food insecurity and getting their perspectives. And that's part of the soft modelling, the soft elicitation of working out what is the system underlying, because some of the policymakers like to think it's just that people don't know how to cook and they can't manage their budget. But we know that that's not really the system. And then getting that into a situation where the councils can have a bespoke tool for this particular region, for those, to evaluate different kinds of interventions for this that might lead to long-term solution rather than simply short getting people over a hump kind of stuff.
Okay, should we wrap up the recording at least?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if there's anything. What should we say? I suppose just thank you very much, really.
Yeah, a heartfelt thank you, because that was really, really interesting.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I really appreciated that. Lots of interesting things came out of that that I hadn't thought about before, or hadn't thought about in the same way. So I'm really interested. Really enjoyed that. Thank you very much, Martine. Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.